Sign it. Right now, Danielle, or you walk out of this room with nothing. Ryan Whitmore didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The command landed heavy anyway, cutting through the glass-walled boardroom like a verdict already decided. 12 executives sat frozen around the long polished table, laptops open, eyes shifting between the man at the head of the room and the woman seated halfway down. The city stretched behind them in perfect lines of steel and sunlight. 27 floors above downtown Chicago, where power was supposed to look clean, controlled, undeniable. But in that moment it felt something else entirely, something tight, something off. Danielle Carter sat still, hands resting lightly in front of her, no rings, no designer bag, no visible sign that she belonged in a room where million-dollar decisions were made before lunch. Her black dress was simple, tailored, intentional, the kind of choice that didn't ask for attention but held it anyway. Ryan slid the documents closer to her, the sound of paper against wood louder than it should have been. You've had your time to think, he added, pacing slowly now, his reflection moving across the glass like he was rehearsing control. Sign the agreement, and we keep this clean. No mess. No headlines. You go your way, I keep the company exactly how it should be. No one interrupted him, not the legal counsel seated to his right, not the senior partner tapping his pen nervously, not even the junior analyst who had only been there 6 months but already looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Danielle didn't reach for the pen. She didn't look at the papers. She looked at Ryan, steady, quiet, like she was measuring something far beyond what was written in ink. You're sure this is how you want it to go? She asked, her voice calm, almost gentle. The kind of tone that didn't match the tension in the room. Ryan smirked, quick, dismissive. I'm more than sure, he said, turning toward the large screen behind him. In fact, I've already handled everything. With a nod, the screen lit up, numbers, assets, properties, accounts, all aligned under his name, or at least that's how it appeared, rows of data scrolling like proof, like finality. Every transfer completed. He continued louder now, confident again. Every share accounted for. You don't have leverage anymore, Danielle. You had access. That's not the same thing. A low murmur passed through the room, subtle, uncertain. One executive leaned toward another, whispering just enough to be heard. Was that approved? But Ryan didn't slow down. Let's be honest, he said, turning back to her. You didn't build this. You married into it. And now you're walking away from it. The words landed, sharp but controlled. No shouting, no theatrics, just enough edge to make their meaning clear. Danielle lowered her gaze for a moment, not in defeat, not in hesitation, but like she was remembering something, a different room, a different time, a voice that didn't rush, didn't need to. Never prove your worth. The memory echoed quietly. Let them reveal what they don't understand. She exhaled softly and reached for the pen. The entire table leaned in just a fraction, waiting. Watching, Ryan's smile widened, victory already forming before the ink touched paper, but instead of signing, Danielle set the pen down, gently, deliberately, the small motion shifting the air in the room more than any argument could have. Ryan's expression tightened, just for a second. What are you doing? He asked, not as confident as before. Danielle lifted her eyes back to him, steady, composed. I'm making sure you're done talking, she said quietly, then reached for her phone. One smooth movement, no rush, no hesitation. She tapped a single contact and brought it to her ear. The room fell into a silence so complete it felt staged, like everyone suddenly understood something was about to change but couldn't yet explain why. Ryan let out a short laugh, forced this time. Go ahead, he said. Call whoever you think can fix this. Danielle didn't respond to him. She only spoke into the phone, calm, clear. It's time. And somewhere behind Ryan, the screen flickered, just once. Barely noticeable, but enough for the analyst in the corner to lean forward, eyes narrowing, as if the numbers he had trusted seconds ago were no longer staying where they were supposed to be. The screen behind Ryan flickered again, this time longer, long enough for several heads around the table to turn at once. The clean rows of numbers that had looked so certain just seconds ago began to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, like something beneath the surface was being rewritten in real time. The junior analyst leaned forward, his chair creaking softly, eyes scanning the columns he had memorized earlier that morning. "That is not right," he whispered, barely audible, but the tension in his voice carried farther than he expected. Ryan did not turn immediately. He waved a hand dismissively as if swatting away doubt. "It is exactly right," he said, though his tone had lost a fraction of its earlier certainty. Danielle remained seated, unmoved, her phone still in her hand, her expression unchanged, as if this moment had already played out in her mind long before anyone else realized they were part of it. The legal counsel beside Ryan shifted in his seat, adjusting his glasses as he stared at the screen. "Can you scroll back?" he asked quietly. The assistant at the control panel hesitated, then complied. The data rolled upward, and that was when it became undeniable. Account names were changing, ownership tags updating, entire blocks of assets reassigning themselves line by line. A low murmur spread through the room, no longer contained, no longer subtle. Ryan turned sharply now, his eyes locking onto the screen. "What did you just do?" he demanded. But he was not looking at Danielle when he said it, he was looking at the numbers, as if they had betrayed him personally. Danielle did not answer right away. She lowered her phone slowly and placed it on the table, her fingers resting lightly on its surface. "I did not do anything," she said, calm, precise. "I just stopped you from continuing something that was never yours to control." The words did not rise in volume, but they carried weight, the kind that settled into the room and refused to leave. One of the senior executives stood halfway out of his chair, confusion written across his face. "These holdings," he said, pointing toward the screen, "they are being redirected to Carter Holdings." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of recognition spreading outward. Another executive turned to Ryan. "You said everything had already been transferred." Ryan's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking between the screen and Danielle. "It was," he insisted, though the confidence in his voice was thinning. "It was transferred to me." The analyst shook his head now, more certain. "No, sir, the system is showing layered ownership, primary control is being reassigned, and it is not to you." Silence followed that statement, heavy and immediate. Danielle finally leaned back in her chair, a small movement, but one that shifted her presence entirely. She was no longer the woman being asked to sign something, she was the only person in the room who seemed to understand what was happening. Ryan took a step toward her, his composure slipping just enough to be noticed. "You think this is a trick?" he said, lower now, more controlled. "You think you can intimidate your way out of this?" Danielle met his gaze without blinking. "I do not need to intimidate anyone," she replied. "You already showed everyone exactly how you think this works." The legal counsel cleared his throat, tension tightening around his words. "Ryan, we may need to pause this meeting." But Ryan did not listen. He turned back to the screen again, watching as another block of assets shifted, entire divisions reclassified under a name he had not expected to see. The assistant at the panel spoke up, hesitant. "There is an external override being executed." Ryan's head snapped toward him. "By who?" The assistant swallowed, eyes flicking toward the display. "Authorization level is executive, primary signature tied to Carter Holdings." The room stilled again, deeper this time, more aware, the weight of that name settling into every corner. Danielle reached for her phone once more, not to call, not to type, just to hold it, like a quiet confirmation of something already in motion. Ryan's voice dropped, almost a whisper now. "What did you just start?" Danielle tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharper now, clearer. "Not what," she said softly. "Who?" And just beyond the glass doors of the boardroom, footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow, deliberate, impossible to ignore, each step drawing closer as the realization began to settle over the room that whatever was about to happen next was not part of Ryan's plan at all. The footsteps did not rush, they did not hesitate, they moved with a steady rhythm that filled the hallway outside the glass walls, each step measured, controlled, and somehow louder than anything that had been said inside the room. Every head turned toward the door without being told to, even Ryan, who had spent the last few minutes trying to hold on to a version of control that was clearly slipping, froze where he stood. His eyes fixed on the entrance, as if willing it not to open. Danielle did not move, she did not turn, she simply sat there, composed, her hands resting lightly on the table as if this moment belonged to her and had all along. The door handle shifted, slow, deliberate, and then the door opened with a quiet click that echoed far louder in the silence than it should have. A man stepped inside, tall, composed, dressed in a charcoal suit that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway. His presence changed the air instantly, not with noise, not with force, but with certainty, the kind that does not need to introduce itself. A few executives straightened in their seats almost instinctively, recognition passing between them and silent glances. One of them whispered under his breath, "That is Victor Carter." The name moved through the room like a current, subtle but undeniable. Ryan did not speak at first, his posture tightening as he tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed he had already secured. Victor Carter did not rush forward. He walked at the same pace he had entered, calm, unbothered, his eyes scanning the room once before settling on Danielle, just for a moment, a brief exchange that said everything without a single word. Then he shifted his attention to Ryan. "I believe you asked someone to sign something," Victor said, his voice even, controlled, carrying across the room without effort. Ryan forced a smile, one that did not quite reach his eyes. "This is a private meeting," he replied, attempting to reassert authority that no longer felt entirely his. "You are not part of this discussion." Victor tilted his head slightly, not in confusion, but in quiet acknowledgement of the attempt. "That is where you are mistaken," he said, stepping closer to the table, his gaze moving briefly to the screen behind Ryan where the data was still shifting, still correcting itself. "Every asset you just presented, every number you relied on, every transfer you believed was final, is tied to Carter Holdings." He paused, just long enough for the weight of that statement to settle. "And I am Carter Holdings." The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of realization, full of recalculation, full of the moment when certainty collapses under the weight of truth. Ryan's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough for everyone in the room to see that something fundamental had shifted. "That is not possible," he said, quieter now, less certain. Victor did not respond immediately. He reached out and lightly tapped the edge of the table, a small gesture that drew attention without demanding it. "You transferred what you thought was ownership," he said. "But you never had primary control, you had conditional access, granted through a structure you never fully understood." The legal counsel stood up slowly now, adjusting his jacket as if the act might help him regain footing. "Mr. Carter," he began, his tone careful, respectful in a way it had not been moments ago. "If this is accurate, then the agreements presented here may not be enforceable." Ryan turned toward him sharply. "They are enforceable," he insisted, but the edge in his voice had dulled, replaced by something closer to urgency. Danielle finally stood, smooth, unhurried, her chair sliding back with a soft sound that seemed to mark the shift more clearly than anything else. She looked at Ryan, not with anger, not with triumph, but with clarity. "You said I had nothing," she said, her voice steady. "But you never asked what I chose not to show." Victor stepped slightly to the side, giving her the space to stand fully in the moment. The screen behind them settled now, the data no longer shifting, the final structure clear to anyone who understood what they were looking at. Entire divisions, properties, and accounts aligned under Carter Holdings, with layered authority that traced directly back to Danielle. Ryan followed her gaze to the screen, then back to her, the realization settling in piece by piece. "You planned this," he said, almost to himself. Danielle shook her head slightly. "No," she replied. "I let you finish." And in that moment, the room understood that what had just unfolded was not a reversal, it was a reveal. The word reveal did not echo, it settled, heavy and permanent, like something the room could not unhear. No one moved for a moment, not the executives, not the legal counsel, not even Ryan, who stood frozen between the screen and the woman he thought he had cornered. His eyes moved slowly back to the data behind him, as if staring long enough might change it back. But the numbers did not shift this time, they held steady, clean, undeniable, Carter Holdings sat at the top of every structure that mattered, layered authority flowing downward with precision, and Danielle's name, no longer hidden, appeared exactly where it had always belonged. Ryan exhaled, a controlled breath that did not quite hide the tension beneath it. "You manipulated the system," he said, his voice quieter now, searching for something to hold on to. Victor did not react immediately, he simply watched, giving Ryan just enough space to finish his thought, to reveal the last pieces of how he saw the world. "No, Victor," replied finally, calm, measured. "The system worked exactly as designed, you just never understood who designed it." That answer did not raise its volume, but it removed any illusion Ryan still had. The legal counsel stepped forward now, more certain, more aligned with where the power in the room had clearly shifted. "Given what we are seeing," he said carefully, "the agreement presented here cannot proceed under these conditions." Ryan turned toward him sharply, but the reaction lacked force. Lacked the authority it had carried earlier. "You are supposed to represent this company," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt outdated, incomplete. The counsel did not step back. "I represent the structure that governs it," he replied. "And that structure is not what you claimed it to be." The room adjusted again, not physically, but in alignment. Chairs straightened, eyes refocused, priorities recalculated in real time. Danielle took a step forward, not dramatic, not rushed, just enough to stand fully across from Ryan, her posture unchanged, but her presence no longer questioned by anyone in the room. "You said I had access," she said, her voice steady. "But you never asked who granted it." Ryan looked at her now, really looked, as if trying to find the version of her that had sat quietly across from him before this moment, the version he thought he understood, but it was gone, or maybe it had never been what he believed. "You let this happen," he said, almost accusing, but also almost realizing. Danielle nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the truth behind the words. "I let you show everyone how you think power works," she replied. "And now they can decide if they trust it." The executives around the table did not speak, but their silence was no longer neutral, it carried weight, it leaned in a direction. One of them closed his laptop slowly, another leaned back with a measured breath, as if recalibrating his position within a structure that had just revealed itself differently. Victor stepped forward one final pace, not to dominate the space, but to finalize it. "This meeting is concluded," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate, not loud, not forceful, simply final. The assistant near the screen hesitated for half a second, then powered down the display, the numbers disappearing but their meaning remaining. Ryan stood there, papers still in his hand, but now they looked smaller, irrelevant, disconnected from the reality that had just been established. Danielle glanced at them briefly, then back at him. "You asked me to sign," she said, calm, composed, "but you never checked if the paper meant anything." Ryan did not respond, not because he chose silence, but because there was nothing left to say that could restore what he thought he had already secured. The room began to shift, chairs moving, quiet conversation starting in low tones, but none of them included him anymore. The structure had realigned, and he was no longer at its center. Danielle turned slightly, not away from him, but forward, as if stepping into a space that had always been hers, and Victor, standing beside her, did not need to say anything else, because everything that mattered had already been made clear. The room did not empty all at once, it shifted in layers, quiet conversations breaking out in low tones as people gathered their things with more care than usual, as if every movement now required recalculation. The power in the room had changed and everyone felt it, even if no one said it out loud. Ryan remained where he stood, the papers still in his hand, but his grip had loosened, the edges no longer sharp with purpose. They hung slightly, like something outdated, something already irrelevant. He looked around, expecting someone to meet his eyes, to anchor him, but no one did, not the legal counsel who was now speaking quietly with another executive, not the analyst who had returned to his seat but was no longer pretending not to understand. Even the assistant near the screen avoided his gaze, focusing instead on shutting down systems that had already told the truth. Danielle did not rush to leave. She stood where she was, composed, as if time itself had slowed around her. Her attention not scattered, not pulled in different directions, but focused, clear. She watched Ryan for a moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of final clarity that did not need emotion to define it. "You built everything on assumption," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him through the noise of shifting conversations. Ryan looked at her, finally, fully, as if seeing her without the filter he had relied on for so long. "I built it on what I was shown," he replied, but the defense lacked strength. It sounded smaller, less certain than it had even minutes ago. Danielle shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "You built it on what you chose to believe." The distinction settled between them, simple, precise, impossible to argue without unraveling everything that had just happened. Victor stood a few steps away, speaking briefly with one of the executives, his tone calm, his presence steady. He did not intervene, he did not need to. This moment was no longer about control, it was about understanding, and that was something Ryan had to reach on his own. The legal counsel approached cautiously, stopping just short of Ryan. "We will need to review all agreements and restructure leadership authority effective immediately," he said, professional, neutral, but clearly aligned with the new reality. Ryan let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition. The fight he thought he was in had ended before he even understood its rules. "So that is it," he said, almost to himself. Danielle stepped closer now, not to confront, not to dominate, but to stand in the space that had always been hers. "No," she replied. "That is clarity." She glanced briefly at the table, at the papers that had started everything, then back at him. "You asked me to sign something that was never yours to offer." Ryan followed her gaze, the realization settling deeper now, not sharp, not sudden, but steady, like something he could not ignore anymore. The room continued to thin, executives exiting in pairs, quiet conversations trailing behind them, but the center of the moment remained, unchanged, Danielle, Ryan, and the truth that had been uncovered. Victor turned back toward them, his expression unchanged, not cold, not warm, simply certain. "This company will move forward," he said, not as a threat, not as a promise, but as a fact, with leadership that understands its foundation. Ryan nodded once, slowly, the motion small but meaningful, the kind that comes when resistance no longer serves a purpose. Danielle watched him for a moment longer, then reached for the papers in his hand, not forcefully, not abruptly, just enough for him to release them without hesitation. She placed them back on the table, untouched, and signed, exactly as they had been meant to remain. "You wanted control," she said, her voice calm, final. "But you never understood what it required." Ryan did not respond, not because he could not, but because the answer no longer mattered. The room had already decided, the structure had already shifted, and Danielle, standing exactly where she had been from the beginning, had never needed to move to prove it. The boardroom no longer felt like a battlefield, it felt like a record, a place where something had been witnessed and could not be undone. The last few executives filtered out through the glass doors, their voices low, their steps measured, each one carrying a different version of the same realization, that what they had just seen was not a sudden shift in power but the exposure of where it had always been. Ryan remained near the head of the table, no longer at its center, no longer directing anything, just present, his posture no longer rigid, no longer performing control. Danielle moved slowly along the length of the table, her fingertips brushing lightly against the polished surface as if grounding the moment, not claiming it, not celebrating it, just acknowledging it for what it was, finished. She paused near the large window overlooking the city, the skyline stretching miles in every direction. Buildings that represented deals, decisions, empires built over decades. She had seen views like this before, but not like this, not after this. Behind her, Ryan finally spoke again, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharp edge it once carried. "How long?" he asked, not looking at her at first, as if the question itself required distance. Danielle turned slightly, not fully, just enough to hear him clearly. "How long did you know this would happen?" He clarified, the words careful, measured, as if he was no longer asking for leverage but for understanding. Danielle considered the question for a moment, not because she did not know the answer, but because she understood what he was really asking. I did not know this moment, she said, but I knew the structure. Ryan nodded once, slowly, absorbing that distinction, his gaze drifting back to the empty chairs around the table. So all of this, he said, gesturing lightly toward the room, toward the space where he had stood minutes earlier with certainty, was never mine. Danielle shook her head, not dismissively, not harshly, just truthfully. It was never yours alone, she replied. And that is the part you refuse to see. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, it was reflective, the kind that forces clarity without demanding it. Victor stood near the door now, speaking quietly into his phone, his tone steady, issuing instructions that did not need repetition. Operations moving forward, adjustments already in motion beyond this room. He ended the call and looked back once, not to check, not to intervene, just to confirm that what needed to be said had already been said. Ryan let out a quiet breath, one that carried weight but no longer resistance. I thought I understood how this worked, he admitted, the words simple, stripped of defense. Danielle walked back toward the table, stopping across from him once more. You understood control, she said, but not structure. She glanced briefly at the documents still resting where she had placed them, untouched, unchanged. Control looks immediate, she continued. Structure is what lasts when no one is watching. Ryan followed her gaze, the realization settling deeper now, not as a shock, but as something that would stay with him long after this room was empty. And you, he said quietly, you chose not to show it. Danielle met his eyes, steady, composed. I chose not to perform it, she corrected, the distinction subtle but absolute, the final pieces aligning between them, not as conflict, but as understanding. The door behind Victor opened again briefly as an assistant stepped in to confirm next steps, then closed just as quietly, the outside world continuing, unaffected by the shift that had just taken place inside. Danielle reached for the edge of the table, her hand resting there for a moment. Grounding, final. This was never about proving anything, she said, her voice calm, unwavering. It was about letting the truth stand on its own. Ryan nodded once more, slower this time, the motion no longer about agreement, but acceptance, the kind that does not need to be spoken again. And as the last traces of conversation faded and the room settled into stillness, it became clear that nothing had been taken from Danielle in this moment, nothing had been given back either, because everything that mattered had been hers from the very beginning. The silence in the boardroom stretched longer than anyone expected, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything important had already been revealed, and now it was settling, layer by layer, into something permanent. Ryan shifted his weight slightly, no longer anchored to the head of the table, no longer performing authority. Just standing there as the reality around him rearranged itself without asking for his approval. Danielle stepped away from the table and walked toward the window again, the city below unchanged, traffic moving, people crossing streets, deals being made in buildings that had no idea what had just unfolded 27 floors above them. She had seen this kind of moment before, not in this exact form, but in essence, the moment when illusion separates from structure and only one of them survives. Behind her, Ryan finally spoke again, but this time there was no edge. No demand, only something quieter, more honest. Why did you stay? He asked, the question landing softly but carrying more weight than anything he had said earlier. Danielle did not answer immediately. She looked out at the skyline, at the reflection of the room faintly visible in the glass, her own image layered over everything beyond it. Because I needed to see if you would ever ask the right question, she said at last, her voice steady. Ryan frowned slightly, not in frustration, but in thought. And I did not, he said, more statement than question. Danielle turned back toward him now, fully, her posture unchanged, but her presence even clearer in the quiet room. You asked how to keep control, she replied. But you never asked what you were actually part of. The distinction landed clean and precise. Ryan let out a slow breath, nodding once as if something finally aligned. I thought building something meant owning it, he admitted. Danielle walked a few steps closer, not closing the distance entirely, just enough to meet him in the space between what was said and what was understood. Building something means understanding what holds it together, she said. Ownership is just a layer, not the foundation. The words did not challenge him, they clarified something he had not known how to define. Victor remained near the door, observing without interruption, his presence no longer shifting the room, just stabilizing it, a quiet confirmation that what had unfolded would continue beyond this moment. Ryan glanced once more at the table, at the untouched documents that had started everything. I was ready to end this, he said, his tone reflective now. To finalize it, to move forward like it was clean. Danielle followed his gaze, then looked back at him. You wanted it to be simple, she said. But it was never simple, it was just hidden. The room felt different now, not tense, not heavy, just clear, the kind of clarity that does not comfort but does not confuse either. Ryan nodded slowly, absorbing it. So what happens now? He asked, not as a demand, not as a challenge, but as someone who understood he was no longer deciding alone. Danielle considered the question, not for long, just enough to answer it truthfully. Now it moves forward, she said, with people who understand it. She did not raise her voice, she did not emphasize the words, but their meaning was unmistakable. Ryan accepted that, not with defeat, but with recognition, the kind that changes how a person stands in a room, even when the room itself has already changed. He straightened slightly, not to reclaim anything, but to meet the moment as it was. I should have asked more questions, he said quietly. Danielle gave a small nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement. Yes, she said. You should have. The simplicity of it held more weight than any argument could have. Victor stepped forward just enough to signal that the moment was complete, not by force, not by command, but by presence, the kind that marks an ending without needing to announce it. Danielle turned toward the door, then paused for a fraction of a second, looking back at the table, at the chair she had sat in, at the space where assumptions had been laid out and quietly dismantled. Then she walked forward, steady, composed, not leaving something behind, but stepping fully into what had always been hers. And Ryan, standing in the stillness she left behind, finally understood that nothing had been taken from him in this room. He had simply seen what he never truly held. The hallway outside the boardroom felt different from the inside, quieter in a way that did not come from silence but from distance, the kind that separates a moment from its consequences. Danielle stepped out first, her pace steady, unhurried, the glass door closing softly behind her as if sealing the room and everything that had just unfolded within it. The corridor stretched long and clean under soft overhead lighting, polished floors reflecting each step with quiet precision. Victor followed a few steps behind, not catching up, not falling back, just present, the way he had been the entire time, consistent, measured, never needing to rush to prove anything. Danielle did not look back at the boardroom, not because she was avoiding it, but because there was nothing left there that required her attention. The moment had completed itself. Inside, Ryan remained where he was, the silence now fully his, not shared, not diffused across a room full of observers, but centered, focused, forcing him to sit with it, to understand it without interruption. He looked at the chair Danielle had occupied, then at the table, then at the documents that had once felt like leverage and now felt like evidence of how little he had actually understood. He moved slowly, placing the papers down where they had started, aligning them carefully, as if restoring order might restore something else, but it did not. The room did not respond, it simply remained, unchanged in structure but entirely different in meaning. Back in the hallway, Danielle reached the elevator and pressed the button once, the soft chime echoing briefly before fading. She stood there, composed, her reflection faint in the brushed metal doors. Victor stepped beside her now, not speaking immediately, giving the moment space, giving her space. When the elevator had not yet arrived, he finally spoke, his voice low, steady. You handled that exactly as you needed to. Danielle did not react right away. She watched the numbers above the door, the slow descent of the elevator, each floor marking a transition from one moment to the next. I did not handle it, she said quietly. I allowed it. Victor glanced at her, not questioning, but understanding the difference. There is a reason you were given that position. he said, not as praise, not as validation, but as acknowledgement. Danielle nodded slightly, her gaze still forward. There is a reason I chose not to use it sooner, she replied, the distinction as precise as everything else she had said. The elevator doors opened with a soft sound, revealing an empty car, polished, quiet, waiting. They stepped inside without hesitation, the doors closed, sealing them into a smaller space, a different kind of silence, one that did not carry tension, only continuation. Victor pressed the button for the ground floor, the number lighting up in soft white. The elevator began its descent, smooth, controlled, the kind of movement that felt almost unnoticeable unless you paid attention. Danielle leaned back slightly, not out of fatigue, but out of release, not emotional, not dramatic, just a shift in posture that marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another. He thought control was something you could take, she said after a moment, her voice even, reflective. Victor gave a small nod. Most people do, he replied, until they see what holds it in place. Danielle glanced briefly at the panel, at the numbers counting down, then back ahead. He saw it today, she said, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. Victor did not respond immediately. The elevator continued its steady descent, floor after floor passing without interruption. Seeing it is not the same as understanding it, he said finally. Danielle considered that, her expression unchanged, but her eyes thoughtful. No, she agreed. But it is where it starts. The elevator slowed as it approached the lower levels, the motion subtle but noticeable, the transition from height to ground becoming real. Above them, the boardroom remained, unchanged in structure but forever altered in meaning. Below them, the rest of the building continued as it always had, unaware of the shift that had just taken place at its highest point. As the elevator neared the lobby, Danielle stood straight again, her posture returning to its natural, composed state, not preparing, not bracing, just moving forward. The doors opened, revealing the wide open space of the ground floor, people moving, conversations flowing, the world continuing without pause. She stepped out first, not looking back, not needing to, because everything that had needed to be seen had already been revealed, and everything that would follow was already in motion. The lobby did not pause for anyone, not for power, not for realization, not for the quiet shift that had just rewritten the structure above it. People moved across the polished floor with purpose, conversations overlapping, phones pressed to ears, footsteps echoing in controlled rhythm. Danielle stepped forward into that flow without hesitation, blending into it without losing presence, her pace steady, her posture composed. As if nothing had changed and everything had. Victor walked beside her. Now, no longer observing from a distance, but still saying little, because nothing needed to be explained twice. A few employees glanced in their direction, some recognizing Victor immediately, their expressions tightening into professional focus, others noticing Danielle only in passing, unaware of the weight she carried through the space. But that was the point, it had always been the point, outside the glass entrance. The city stretched wide and active, cars moving in steady lines, sunlight reflecting off steel and glass, the rhythm of a place that never stopped for any single moment. Danielle pushed through the revolving door, stepping into the air without breaking stride, the shift from controlled interior to open street subtle but real, a reminder that what happened inside one room could ripple outward without ever announcing itself. Victor paused briefly beside her, adjusting his jacket, not out of habit, but as a transition, the kind that marks movement from one role into another without changing identity. They will adjust quickly, he said, his tone calm, certain. Danielle looked ahead, watching the movement of people crossing the intersection, the timing of lights, the precision of flow. They always do, she replied, not dismissive, not impressed, just aware. A black car pulled up along the curb, quiet, expected, the driver stepping out without needing instruction. Danielle did not move toward it immediately. She stood for a moment longer, not lingering, not hesitating, just allowing the space to settle around her. The building behind her rose high, its glass reflecting the sky, hiding the room where everything had just shifted, and for a second, she remembered another building, years earlier, smaller, less polished, where she had been asked to wait in a lobby while decisions were made about her without her. She had been younger then, dressed carefully, speaking clearly. And still overlooked, not because she lacked anything, but because she was measured against assumptions she had not created. The memory did not sting anymore. It clarified, it reminded, it grounded. She turned slightly toward Victor, her voice even. You told me once that silence is only powerful if it is chosen. Victor gave a small nod, recognizing the moment without interrupting it. And you chose it, he said. Danielle nodded once. Because I needed to know if they would hear anything else, she replied. The driver opened the back door, waiting. Without speaking, Victor stepped aside, allowing her to move first, not out of formality, but out of recognition. Danielle walked toward the car, then paused just before getting in, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the door. She looked back at the building, not with emotion, not with regret, but with understanding, the kind that comes after something has fully revealed itself. He thought this was about ownership, she said quietly, more to the moment than to anyone else. Victor responded without looking back. Most people confuse access with authority. Danielle entered the car, settling into the seat with the same calm she had carried through every part of the day. Victor followed, the door closing softly behind them, sealing the space. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into traffic without disruption, blending into the city's constant motion. Danielle looked out the window as the building grew smaller in the distance, not fading, just becoming part of everything else. He saw it, she said after a moment, her voice steady. Victor nodded slightly. Yes, he replied. But now he has to live with it. The car moved forward, the city opening up ahead, and for the first time that day, there was nothing left to reveal, only what would come next. The car moved steadily through downtown traffic, blending into the rhythm of the city as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside, the silence carried a different weight, not tension, not uncertainty, but resolution. Danielle sat by the window, watching buildings pass in reflections of glass and steel, each one representing systems, decisions, hierarchies that most people never fully saw, and for a moment, she let herself sit in that understanding, not as something she needed to prove, but as something she had always known. Victor remained beside her, composed, his gaze forward, not because there was nothing to say, but because what mattered now was no longer in words, it was in what would follow. The driver turned onto a wider avenue, sunlight cutting across the windshield, illuminating the interior in brief flashes before settling again. Danielle spoke first, her voice even, thoughtful. He thought the moment would define everything. Victor nodded slightly, recognizing the pattern without needing explanation. Most people believe control happens in a single decision, he said. They forget it is built long before that moment ever arrives. Danielle leaned her head slightly back against the seat, her eyes still on the passing city. He prepared for the outcome, she said, but not for the structure behind it. Victor glanced at her briefly, then back ahead. Preparation without understanding only works until it is tested, he replied. The car slowed at a light, the city pausing for just a second before continuing again, people crossing the street, conversations overlapping, life moving forward without acknowledgement of what had just shifted above it all. Danielle watched a young professional step off the curb, briefcase in hand, moving quickly, focused, unaware, and it reminded her of a time when she moved through spaces the same way, not lacking clarity, but lacking recognition from others. She remembered sitting across from a table years ago, presenting ideas that were met with polite dismissal. Not because they were weak, but because they came from someone who was not expected to hold them. She had not argued then, not raised her voice. She had simply taken note, learned the structure, understood where decisions were truly made, and built from there. The light turned green, the car moved forward again. Danielle exhaled softly, not out of relief, but out of completion. He will try to rebuild something from this, she said, not as a question, but as an observation. Victor did not hesitate. He will try, he said. But now he knows the difference between holding something and actually having it. Danielle nodded once, accepting that, not as a judgment, but as a natural outcome. The car passed a series of buildings that gradually gave way to a quieter district, less crowded, more deliberate, the pace of the surroundings shifting just enough to be felt. Danielle turned slightly toward Victor. You did not step in until the end, she said, her tone calm, not questioning, but acknowledging. Victor met her gaze briefly. It was never my moment to control, he replied. It was yours to define. Danielle held that for a second, then looked back out the window, understanding not just the words, but the intent behind them, the trust, the structure that allowed her to stand where she had stood without needing reinforcement. The car turned into a private drive, the movement smooth, intentional, leading toward a building set back from the street, quiet, secure. The kind of place where decisions continued without interruption from the outside world. As the car slowed to a stop, Danielle did not reach for the door immediately. She sat there for a brief second longer, letting the transition complete itself, the shift from one space to another, from one phase to the next. It was never about the papers, she said quietly, almost to herself. Victor responded just as calmly. No, he said. It was about what he believed they represented. Danielle gave a small nod, the clarity now complete, the layers fully revealed. The driver stepped out and opened the door. Danielle exited first, stepping onto the ground with the same steady presence she had carried through every moment of the day. Victor followed, and as they walked toward the entrance, the world did not pause, it did not react, it simply continued. Because the real shift had never needed an audience, it had only needed to happen. The building they entered did not announce itself with noise or grandeur, it stood quiet and precise, glass and steel arranged with intention rather than excess, the kind of place where decisions were not displayed, they were executed. Danielle walked through the entrance without breaking stride, the doors opening smoothly as if anticipating her arrival. Inside, the lobby was calm, controlled, a contrast to the movement of the city outside. A receptionist glanced up briefly, recognition. Immediate but unspoken, a nod given, nothing more, because here, acknowledgement did not require performance. Victor walked beside her, his presence still steady, but now it carried a different weight, not authority being revealed, but authority being resumed, the kind that did not need introduction twice. Danielle moved toward the private elevators, her reflection briefly catching in the polished walls. Not as a moment of self-awareness, but as confirmation, everything aligned, everything in place. The elevator doors opened without delay, and they stepped inside, the ascent beginning almost immediately, smooth, silent, the kind of motion that felt inevitable rather than forced. As the numbers climbed, Danielle spoke, her voice even. It is strange, she said, not looking at Victor, but at the panel in front of her. How quickly a room can change when one assumption falls apart. Victor gave a slight nod, his gaze steady. Assumptions are efficient, he replied, until they meet structure. Danielle considered that, the words settling naturally, as if they had always been there waiting to be acknowledged. He relied on them, she said, every step of the way. Victor did not disagree. He relied on what he could see, he said, and ignored what was holding it together. The elevator continued upward, floor after floor passing without interruption, each level marking a return, not to something new, but to something established, something that had always existed beneath the surface of everything else. Danielle leaned slightly against the back wall, not out of fatigue, but out of reflection. There was a moment, she said, her tone thoughtful, when I wondered if he would stop, if he would question it. Victor turned his head just enough to acknowledge the statement. And if he had? He asked, not as a test, but as curiosity. Danielle allowed a brief pause before answering. Then today would have looked very different, she said simply. The elevator slowed as it reached the upper floors, the motion subtle but noticeable, the transition from movement to arrival becoming real. But he did not, Victor added, not as judgment, but as fact. Danielle nodded once, accepting it fully. The doors opened to a private floor, quiet, controlled, the kind of space where fewer words were needed because more was already understood. They stepped out, the environment shifting once again, less public, more precise. An assistant approached, composed, professional, holding a tablet with updates already prepared. The board has been notified, she said, her voice clear, efficient. And the transition process has begun. Danielle listened without interruption, absorbing the information without reaction. Timeline, she asked, her tone steady. The assistant responded immediately. Initial adjustments within 24 hours, full structural alignment within 72. Danielle nodded, the response expected, the process already in motion before it had been spoken aloud. Victor glanced at the assistant briefly, unsure. Communication is direct, he said. No ambiguity. The assistant nodded once and stepped back, already moving to execute. Danielle walked further into the space, toward a large window that overlooked the city from a different angle, higher, quieter, more removed. She stood there for a moment, looking out, not searching, not questioning, just observing. The city below continued as it always did, unaware of the shift that had already taken place, and that was how it would remain, because true structure did not announce itself. It operated, it held, it endured. Danielle turned slightly, her expression unchanged, but her presence now fully aligned with everything around her. It was never about proving anything, she said, her voice calm, carrying easily in the quiet space. Victor met her gaze, understanding without needing clarification. No, he replied. It was about letting the truth stand where it already was. Danielle gave a small nod, the final piece settling into place, not as an ending, but as continuation, the kind that did not need to begin again because it had never actually stopped. The office floor remained quiet, not empty, but intentional, every movement measured, every conversation purposeful, the kind of environment where nothing was rushed because everything was already in motion. Danielle stood by the window, the city stretching far beyond the glass, not as a distraction, but as context, a reminder that structure extended beyond any single building, any single moment, behind her. The assistant moved efficiently, coordinating updates, confirming transitions, ensuring that what had been revealed was now being reinforced through action. Victor stood a few steps back, observing not just the room, but the rhythm of it, the way decisions translated into movement without hesitation. Danielle turned from the window slowly, her gaze settling on the space around her, the desk, the seating, the quiet hum of a system already recalibrating itself. They will talk about this, she said, her voice calm, not concerned, not dismissive, simply aware. Victor gave a slight nod. They already are, he replied. But not about what you think. Danielle stepped forward, her posture unchanged, but her focus sharper now. Not about the papers, she said, more to confirm than to question. Victor met her gaze steady. No, he said. They will talk about what it exposed. Danielle allowed that to settle, understanding that perception would follow structure, not lead it. Good, she said quietly, not as approval, but as alignment. The assistant approached again, tablet in hand. Legal has initiated review across all related agreements, she reported, and internal communications are being adjusted to reflect the updated authority structure. Danielle listened without interruption, then gave a small nod. Keep it direct, she said. No interpretation. The assistant acknowledged and stepped back, already moving to implement. Victor shifted slightly, his attention returning to Danielle. You understand what comes next, he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Danielle did not hesitate. Consistency, she replied. Not reaction. Victor gave a small nod, the answer expected, but still necessary. They will look for change, he said. For something immediate, visible. Danielle walked toward the center of the room, her steps unhurried, her presence steady. And they will not find it, she said, because nothing actually changed. The distinction was precise, and it carried weight. This was not a takeover, not a reversal, it was a correction, a return to what had always been true. The assistant paused briefly at the edge of the room, as if waiting for confirmation. Danielle glanced in her direction, then back to Victor. Schedule the board for tomorrow, she said, her tone even, decisive. Full review, no delays. The assistant nodded and moved quickly to execute. Victor watched the exchange without interruption, then spoke, his voice low, controlled. And him, he said, not naming Ryan, not needing to. Danielle understood immediately, her expression unchanged. He will be addressed, she replied. But not here. Victor studied her for a moment, not questioning, but assessing, then gave a slight nod, accepting the decision. Make sure it is clear, he said. Danielle met his gaze steady. It will be, she replied, the certainty in her voice not loud, but absolute. The room settled again into its rhythm, updates moving, decisions aligning, the structure reinforcing itself without noise. Danielle walked back toward the window one last time, not to reflect, not to reconsider, but to observe the continuation of everything beyond this space. The city did not pause, it did not react, it simply moved forward, and that was exactly how it would remain, because what had happened was not disruption, it was alignment, and alignment does not need attention, it only needs to hold. Danielle turned away from the glass, her posture unchanged, her presence fully integrated into the space around her. It was never about the moment, she said. Quietly, almost to herself, Victor responded without hesitation. No, he said. It was about what the moment revealed. Danielle gave a small nod, the final layer settling into place, not as an ending, but as confirmation. Everything that needed to be seen had been seen, everything that needed to move was already in motion, and nothing about it required explanation beyond what had already been made clear. The room did not feel like a conclusion, it felt like alignment, the kind that does not arrive with noise but settles into place with quiet certainty. Danielle stood at the center of it, not elevated, not isolated, but exactly where she had always belonged, the systems around her moving with precision, each decision flowing into the next without hesitation. The assistant's voice carried softly from across the room as updates continued to come in, timelines confirmed, transitions executed. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just the steady progression of structure doing what it was designed to do. Victor remained nearby, not directing, not correcting, simply present, a constant that did not need to assert itself. Danielle moved toward the desk, her hand resting briefly on its surface, not claiming it, not testing it, just acknowledging the weight it carried, the kind of weight that did not come from position, but from understanding. She looked out once more at the city beyond the glass, the movement below unchanged, people continuing their routines, unaware of the shift that had already taken place above them, and that was how it would remain, because true authority did not require visibility, it required consistency. Behind her, the assistant stepped forward again. Board confirmation is complete, she said, her tone steady. All members will be present tomorrow. Danielle nodded once, the response expected, the process already unfolding exactly as it should. And communications? She asked, not turning. The assistant responded immediately. Aligned with structural authority, no deviation. Danielle allowed a brief pause, then gave a small nod. Good, she said, her voice calm, final. Victor stepped closer, not to intervene, but to complete the moment, his presence marking the transition from revelation to continuation. Everything is in place, he said, not as reassurance, but as confirmation. Danielle turned slightly toward him, her expression unchanged, but her presence fully settled. It always was, she replied, the simplicity of the statement carrying more weight than anything that had come before. The room fell into a quiet rhythm again, not empty, not still, but focused, each movement purposeful, each decision aligned. Danielle walked past the desk, not stopping, not hesitating, moving forward with the same steady pace she had carried from the beginning. The door ahead of her opened as she approached, not automatically, but because someone was already there to meet her movement, to anticipate it, to respond to it. She stepped through without breaking stride, Victor following just behind, the corridor beyond quiet, controlled, leading forward without distraction. As they walked, Danielle spoke one last time, her voice even, measured. He thought power was something you prove in a moment, she said, not looking back. Victor responded without pause. Power is what remains when the moment is over. Danielle gave a small nod, the final distinction settling into place, not as a lesson, not as a warning, but as truth. They reached the end of the corridor, the space opening into another part of the building, another phase, another continuation, and without hesitation, Danielle stepped forward into it, not because something had changed, but because everything had finally been seen for what it was, and in that clarity, there was nothing left to claim, nothing left to defend, only what had always been there, steady, undeniable, and entirely hers.